and to be in Rome. I'm going to come back to Paola in just a moment because there's another form of thanks which I want to give her, which is actually part of what I want to say this afternoon. But also thank you to Laura for her paper, which has opened up a space for talking about the socialization of women and women's learning of their place in the academy. Because in the light of what has been said this afternoon, I do want to make some remarks about what seem to me to be existing, ongoing difficulties about the ways in which women relate to both professional knowledge in the sense of participation in the academy and also to knowledge in a more general sense. I want to come back to Paola because I want to thank her for the title of this afternoon and indeed today's and yesterday's, the title of the conference, Italian Experiments and Experiences. I particularly like this title because it opened up for me the space to use an example from fiction, which seems to me to be entirely pertinent to what we've been talking about today. And the example is the case of the heroine of George Eliot's novel Middlemarch. Those of you who have read the novel will recall at one point in the novel, not too far from the beginning, we meet Dorothea Brooke on her honeymoon in Rome, sobbing miserably because the marriage, the honeymoon, the whole journey has turned into a huge disappointment. It's not my place this afternoon to speak of the personal difficulties, the emotional difficulties, which may have occurred on that particular honeymoon. But what I do want to speak about is the question of the appalling mistake that Dorothea made. The mistake of confusing her love of knowledge, her wish to do well in the world, with affection for a particular male other. And that particular male other, the man she marries, who is called Casaubon, seems to me to represent and to carry to us and to give to us certain human characteristics, but also certain metaphorical characteristics which we might use in thinking about what we continue to describe as the male academy and patriarchal knowledge. I'm not so sure that those terms today are any longer absolutely the case, but nevertheless, universities, I think, still carry on and continue some of those traditions which we can associate with that one particular individual. The characteristics are these: a furious jealousy of the knowledge which they possess, an absolute determination to marginalize others who might contribute to an intellectual project, and an intense jealousy and rage about any intervention in what might seem to be a particular project, a particular course of study. As you will know if you read the novel, it's the case that on that particular holiday in Rome, one of the young friends, or one of the other young people who happens to be in that city at the same time, points out that poor old Casaubon had no hope of knowing what he wanted to know, precisely because his mind was so closed to the other that he had no knowledge of those other experiences and those other places. Casaubon, it seems to me, is the perfect human embodiment of much that has continued in many universities. A refusal of others, a refusal of the acceptance of other kinds of experiences, other kinds of ideas, and of course, in the most literal form, in many cases and in many countries, and indeed in many countries still today, the actual literal presence of women. So let us not become too preoccupied with the metaphorical examples of this case, because there are, of course, very many parts of the world where literal women are quite determinedly excluded from access to certain kinds of knowledge and its construction. So I think what we're left with in the case of Dorothea and Casaubon is a sense, albeit a 19th century sense, of the worst case scenario of women and their relationship to knowledge. It's to make basic confusions between those who possess knowledge and those who are going to develop it in others. And it seems to me that this point is particularly crucial at the beginning of the 21st century, because I think universities very often refuse to learn and to accept two lessons about themselves. The first is that universities, at least in the country from which I come, which is the United Kingdom, have in many ways, in terms of their power structures and what they, quotes, will allow, changed very little from 1937, when Virginia Woolf published 3 Guineas. If you look in the English edition of that book, you will see a photograph of a graduation procession in English universities. That procession is composed of old, middle-class, white men. If you look at the graduation processions in many universities in the United Kingdom today, in 2009, you would probably find exactly the same cast of characters. Inclusion, it seems to me, has never been a strong point of universities, and that continues to this day. The second point that I would make about universities and the academy is that they have very often, and I think are still, very unprepared to accept that many of the transformative ideas of the 19th and 20th century have come from outside the academy. Marx, Darwin, Freud, to mention 3 of the great patriarchs of Western modernity, were not people who sat in universities or competed for university chairs. Socialism, feminism, Marxism, psychoanalysis, the transforming ideas which have led to what we now see as Western and live in as Western modernity came from outside. And I also want to add another person here whose relationship to knowledge and to the history of women and universities seems to me to be a very good example of how it is the case that moving outside the university, and indeed moving between the university and the world outside, gives a very much greater power and indeed relevance to their work. The case, of course, is that of Simone de Beauvoir. Again, to quote English publications, in English editions of de Beauvoir's work, she is usually described as having graduated from the Sorbonne, second to Jean-Paul Sartre. It seems to me that that definition of a woman in relation